Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's briefing. I am Tina Combs, a Senior Program Officer for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Thank you for joining us as we unpack and talk about the importance of the OMB's updated race and ethnicity standards. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping tips and requests. First, this event will be recorded. All mics are muted except for the presenters, and closed captioning is available. And finally, please enter questions using the Q&A function or use the raise hand function if you're having any technical difficulties, and our tech support will help you. We will respond to the Q&A, but after the moderated discussion with our panel experts. For those of you who don't know us, RWJF is the largest philanthropy in the US focused on health and healthcare. In partnership with others, we are working to develop a culture of health rooted in equity that provides every individual with a fair and just opportunity to thrive, no matter who they are, where they live, or how much money they have. For over a decade, we have funded research and advocacy efforts aimed to improve policies and practices so that race and ethnicity data can be disaggregated in more meaningful ways that advance health and data equity. And for the last several years, we've been proud to support and partner with a number of researchers and social justice organizations around the nation, including the tremendous leaders that join me today. Most recently, RWJF's National Commission to Transform Public Health Data Systems called for our nation's public health system to measure and address structural racism and other inequities. It also specifically deemed updating federal minimum standards for race and ethnicity data as pivotal to creating an equity-centered public health data system. So we're incredibly thrilled that for the first time since 1997, 25 years ago, the Office of Management and Budget has made important changes to its minimum standards that capture historically excluded communities who will now be seen in federal data for the first time. This is a key step that will better reflect the nation's diversity and lead to resources and interventions that are more targeted to those who need it most. So before we start with the discussion, I want to pose a question via a poll just to kind of level set. And the question is, how familiar are you with the OMB's updated race ethnicity standards? There are three choices: very familiar, somewhat familiar, or not familiar. And I will give you a few seconds to answer that question. And here are the results. So it looks like almost half are very familiar, almost half are somewhat familiar, and about 14% of you are not familiar with these changes. And hopefully that will change with this discussion. So before I introduce panelists, I want to briefly highlight the three major updates made by the OMB and why these changes are so urgently needed. First, race and ethnicity will now be measured using a single combined question on federal surveys and censuses. Second, a new minimum ethnicity category for individuals with Middle Eastern or North African origins, also known as MENA, has been added to the combined race and ethnicity question so that individuals of MENA descent are no longer defined exclusively as white. And last but not least, all federal agencies will now be required, instead of simply encouraged, to collect detailed race and ethnicity data to ensure more nuanced data analysis and presentation. And while more work needs to be done to ensure the new standards reflect the full diversity of our nation, the imperative for race and ethnicity data that are more inclusive is long overdue and more relevant than ever. Current data collection and reporting place people under broad categories that have masked significant heterogeneity and rendered some populations completely invisible when policies are made, resources are allocated, and programs are designed and implemented. And that lack of representative data impedes the advancement of health, well-being, and equity because everyone's lived experience isn't reflected in the data. So now I'd like to turn to and to introduce our panel. First, we have Mita Anand, who's a Senior Program Director of the Census and Data Equity Team at the Leadership Conference Education Fund. Maya Berry, who is the executive director from the Arab American Institute. We're also joined by Rosalind Gold, who's the chief public policy officer at Naleo Educational Fund, and Terry Al Minnis, who's the vice president of census and voting programs at Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Welcome to all of you. We'll just give a second for them to appear on screen. So I'd like to start with kind of a big picture question directed to Mita. I briefly described some of the major changes to the minimum federal standards, but can you tell us more about why having better data on race ethnicity is so important and so meaningful for ensuring social justice and equity?
Absolutely, Tina, and thank you so much for having me here. So I would like to start even bigger picture, which is that when we look at data, we are telling a story about our communities and our nation. And so when you have data that more accurately reflects how people see themselves, they have the opportunity to tell the story of who they are and of who we are as a nation. It presents the opportunity for people to write themselves into the story of the nation instead of having it written for them, which is what we see when we have an accurate category. Specific around your question around civil rights and public health and looking at the meaningfulness on a day-to-day basis, I'd say there are four categories. We use these data to ensure equal opportunities. We enforce civil rights laws, including housing, education, healthcare, voting. Then we're looking at how policies, analyzing how policies are impacting different communities, and then also how we are administering programs. So with more accurate data, we are able to perform comparisons and analyze disparities and really be able to more target the outcomes and interventions that we need. And then I would also like to say, especially in the healthcare field, which I know Robert Wood Johnson wonders about and cares about deeply, you start seeing things like we saw so many stories, right, about Black maternal health mortality. That is as a result of having race and ethnicity data collection. When you start getting to more granular data, like we are going to be able to get with these new standards, you can start examining how within subpopulations you might see different outcomes as to who is more likely to suffer from a particular disease or condition. And that really allows for being able to target the outcomes, as I was saying before.
Thanks, Mita. It's so valuable to understand in the big scheme of things why this is just so important at a basic level. Maya, what do you expect to see now that for the first time people of Middle Eastern and North African descent will be made visible in data collection?
Well, thank you, Tina, and thanks to all my colleagues for joining us today. I expect to see for the first time ever a closer number that accurately reflects the count of both MENA populations in the United States as well as Arab Americans. And to give you a sense of that, according to census, we have roughly 2.8 million Arab Americans in the United States today. Our numbers put it closer to 3.7. And this is based on not even having had the category. So imagine how proactively one has to be to check a box that didn't exist, right? So there was sort of nothing there, and then to write in your national origin or ethnicity. So I think it's a pretty significant shift from going from that number to 3.7. And in the case of MENA populations more broadly, the Bureau tells us in a report they published earlier this year, there are roughly 3.5 million people from the MENA region. Again, taking our formula and looking at it, we get closer to like 4.6. That discrepancy, as Mita kind of really grounded the conversation in, is about people. That data is about people. It's about everything that impacts their lives directly. And that includes the health disparities that we talk about, it includes the civil rights protection. So for us, for the first time ever, this is really a transformative moment. Decades in the making.
Thanks, Maya. It's truly historic. And Roz, what makes the combined question to ask about Hispanic ethnicity and racial identification so much more effective in gathering data on how Latinos and Hispanics identify themselves compared to the previous two-question approach?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Tina, and we greatly appreciate the work of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in putting this briefing together, and thank you for everybody who's joining us. So we believe that the revised standards adoption of a combined question approach to asking about race and ethnicity is a very long overdue and very critical step toward obtaining better data that really illuminates the full diversity of the Latino community. So under the previous approach, where Latinos were first asked about Latino ethnicity and then asked for their racial identity, when Latinos came to the racial question, they didn't see themselves in the racial category. When we did our work during census outreach in the Latino community, we heard constantly from community members that the separate question on race was confusing or didn't capture their identity. And for the census, many of these Latinos either left that question on race blank or answered some other race. And this has likely resulted in a very distorted view of not only the racial identification of Latinos, but also other populations. So research by the Bureau shows that the combined question approach, where community members are asked about their Latino ethnicity and their racial identity in one question, does a better job of allowing Latinos to find themselves in the census form and determine how they see themselves. And it is particularly important that community members are asked to indicate all of the racial and ethnic groups that reflect their identity. Another positive aspect of the revised standards is that they allow Latinos to indicate more than one subgroup or national origin identity. For example, they can now indicate that they are Mexican and Salvadoran, or Dominican and Puerto Rican, without being forced to choose only one of those national origin or subgroups. And this is going to better allow us to understand the differences between these groups and issues that affect everything from health disparities to employment and educational opportunities, to experiences with discrimination. We're going to have more precise and nuanced data to better understand the full diversity of the Latino community.
Thanks, Roz. And during the comment period from the OMB, the Interagency Working Group, Afro-Latinos and Afro-MENA individuals expressed concerns about how these changes might affect their communities in particular. Can both you, Roz, and Mai, could you talk about how the OMB and its federal partners can ensure that those concerns are addressed over the next few years?
So yes, we really share the important concerns raised by Afro-Latino researchers and civic leaders and community members about whether the combined question approach is going to really fully signal to Afro-Latinos to indicate both their Latino ethnicity and their Black racial identification. And this is really important data we need to have. We were pleased to see that when the OMB announced the standards, they identified the need to do more research on this issue as they move forward with implementation. So it's really critical that in doing this research, the OMB and the Census Bureau consult very closely with Afro-Latino research and leaders on everything from designing the research, identifying the questions the research needs to answer. And these researchers and leaders, Afro-Latinos, need to be at the table in an ongoing dialogue about how about the format and wording of the question, how to best conduct outreach about it to community members, and how to tabulate and present the data so that it's relevant and accessible. This consultation is crucial if we want the combined question to collect complete and accurate Latino on data, complete and accurate data on Latinos that we hope it will.
Tina, it's an excellent question. And in our conversations we were having earlier about this, I think the way I framed it is folks were like, is this glass half empty or is it glass, half full? And I said, for the first time ever, we have a glass. So let's start there. I want to note how important this part is, right? Having said that, it's absolutely critical that we get this right, because what we don't want to do is to go from having been rendered invisible in the data to a continued chronic undercount. And part of the way that we make sure that that does not not happen is that we understand that MENA is a broad geographical, racially diverse category. And as we've talked about it, as it took decades to get here, right? We're talking about folks that come from the Arab world. We're talking about non-Arab MENA, which includes Iranians and Israelis and folks from Turkey, from our perspective, because geographically that's where it is, and transnational communities that are really a sizable portion of folks from the MENA region here in the United States. So in order to get that right, we have to understand, in the case of transnational communities, Armenian Americans here in the US are nearly 500,000 people. If we have a MENA checkbox that doesn't accurately capture Armenian Americans, I think that's a problem. In the case of Arab Americans, we have as an ethnicity, a racially diverse community. So Afro-Arabs, like the point that Roz is making here, they have to be able to be represented in the data. And that means a combined question that says, I can identify this way racially, and if I choose to identify my ethnicity, I'm going to be able to do this, and to be able to go into the way the data is tabulated, the way that the question is formulated, the way that this is ultimately coded going into the 2030 decennial census. All of that is absolutely critical to getting the accurate data that accurately represents the racial diversity of folks from the MENA region.
Thanks, Maya. Both you and Roz raised some really important points. And Terry, can you talk about how the required collection of detailed subgroups address the needs of the Asian American community, which has been advocating for better disaggregated data for decades? And then also, what are the opportunities that are available for groups to engage with federal agencies to make sure their communities are represented?
Sure. Thank you for those questions, Tina. As we've seen under the previous standards, very few agencies voluntarily disaggregated data, even when such activity was both allowable and encouraged. So this new requirement for detailed data collection is really an important step forward and a major win for the Asian American community. Detailed data are particularly critical for us because being among the nation's fastest growing and most diverse racial group, we're often viewed as homogenous or a monolith. And that's simply not true. We are a community that includes more than 30 detailed subgroups that can differ dramatically across key social and economic indicators. For example, in the context of health disparities, as I know some of my colleagues have discussed, we know that US-born Vietnamese American women are 4 times more likely to die of breast cancer than any other Asian American group. And that Korean American children are 4 times more likely to have no health insurance as compared to others. So data disaggregation is critical because it allows for us to see these differences, to Mita's point earlier. And when data are not disaggregated, broad trends can mask much more negative or nuanced outcomes for specific subgroups of people, leaving the needs and issues of the specific subgroups invisible and unmet. The good news is the new revised standards, in addition to mandating the detailed data collection, also provides opportunities for the public to engage and make sure that their communities are represented. First, OMB committed in the Federal Register notice to establishing an interagency committee on race and ethnicity statistical standards, which will be convened by the chief statistician, and they will maintain and carry out a government-wide research agenda, much to the point of what Roz and Maya were talking about needs to be researched, and undertaking a regular review of SBD 15, which should be taking place on a 10-year cycle, and explicitly will include an opportunity for public input. Also interesting to note that the Federal Register noticed that notwithstanding this regular review cycle of 10 years, they do sort of allow themselves an opportunity to initiate a review of SBD 15 at any time that they choose. Second, the revised standards set an 18-month deadline for agencies to publish an action plan on race and ethnicity data that really outlines how they plan to comply with these standards within the 5-year deadline that they've been given to become in compliance. And the agencies are required to make these plans available to the public through the websites. And finally, OMB recognized the need to balance consistency, right? The need for consistency with the ability to adapt to change and the need to meet specific program needs. And so the standards actually allow for agencies to submit a request to OMB's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs for an exemption to this this mandatory detailed data disaggregation if the agency determines that the potential benefit of the detailed data would not justify the additional burden to the agency and the public, or the additional risk to privacy or confidentiality, or a agency could also submit for a variance to the detailed categories that have been listed in the standards if they determine that collecting different detailed data categories would be more useful or provide more accurate data for the collection's specific context and intended use. The important thing to know is that that this is not a just self-determination by the agency and they get to set that standard. They do have to apply for any type of variance from the standards, and then OMB will review the agency requests for exceptions and variances and will only approve them if they contain sufficient justification. And because these variances and applications, if you will, must be authorized through the Paperwork Reduction Act information collection approval process, we know that by law, that process in most cases will include at least 3 months of public public comment. So that'll also be an opportunity for the public to be engaged.
Thanks, Terry. It's so helpful to understand better what that process would look like, because the idea of who gets to decide whether collecting those detailed data are a burden or not, I think is critical. And so knowing that there's an opportunity for communities to provide that comment, I think is a huge asset. We have a couple of more moderated questions for the panel experts, but I just want to also remind folks on the webinar to please submit your questions through the Q&A box, and we will get to those in just a few minutes. So I have my next question is for any of the panel experts who want to jump into it. We've talked about the check boxes for detailed subgroups that have been added or will be added to the new standards. And for most of the ethnic and racial groups, those check boxes and those subgroups were based on population size. That's not the case for the MENA community. I think there was a different algorithm that seemed to be used for them. But can each of you talk about both the limitations as well as the opportunities with this approach, with focusing on kind of population size, which is the rationale that the OMB provided for selecting which groups they would kind of highlight on the form? So whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll jump in real quick on this one, given that it's the brand new category. And actually, it's important to kind of start there, right? One of the key elements I think you're going to hear from every single one of us multiple times is research and testing. It's incredibly important. These are signaling examples for respondents. Let's just be honest. Most normal people are not like us. They don't spend the time doing this level of detailed work regarding, data collection methods. So a normal respondent will just see this and say, oh, look, that the checkboxes and the write-in examples are provided as signaling examples, and getting those right, getting the question wording right. Those are absolutely critical to being able to gather the data, which is, again, ultimately the objective for all of us. So in the case of MENA, Tina, you're correct. I don't think if you follow the logic of what was provided in terms of checkboxes and write-ins, it really wasn't the top population. Two, because the MENA category is so diverse, both geographically, racially, we advocated a different approach than largest population size. We talked about a country from the Levant, a country from the North Africa, a country from the Arabian Peninsula, a non-Arab example, and a transnational example. And the point of that, again, is we're counting Americans, we're counting folks here, and making sure that we have signaling examples that accurately reflect that. And in our case here, and which is why I'm so pleased to hear what Terry is sharing, right? Terry laid out for us a process where folks can say, thank you, tremendous work has gone into this, and we're deeply grateful for the interagency working group and what we arrived at. But it's a little unusual for OMB to prescribe the specific individual checkboxes and write in examples. And that really sort of needs to rely with the Bureau, and they need to do more research and testing to make sure, are we getting it right? So in the case of MENA, I don't see an Afro-MENA example. I don't see Sudanese. I don't see Mauritanians. I don't see Somalis. And that's an issue. I don't see Armenians, who are 500,000 people within the MENA category. And to be clear, I also think that we've made a tremendous amount of progress in terms of understanding the diversity of the American population. I think we have to think about, are the signaling examples appearing in more than one place as well? Because the point is, we want to collect the racial data, but at the same time, with regards to MENA, we also need the ethnicity piece. So I worry that what's here won't do that accurately, which is why we're going to be so deeply engaged in the process that Terry has laid out.
And for the Afro-Latino community, again, we share the concerns. If you look at the specific examples, checkboxes and the examples under the Black or African American category, that Afro-Latinos may not see themselves in those categories. And we're concerned that Afro-Latinos will not indicate both their Black identity and their Latino ethnicity. And this, again, is why this research is so important. What is the best way to structure these questions so that Afro-Latinos see themselves? How do we make sure that Afro-Latinos are at the table? We must make sure that Afro-Latino researchers and civic leaders are at the table as this research proceeds. We really need to have meaningful consultation with the Afro-Latino community to determine how to make sure that Afro-Latinos see themselves in the questions.
And quickly, just to highlight a lot of what has been said, definitely, I think the checkboxes and the examples, the write-in box examples, are really critical for the signaling purpose that both Maya and Roz have discussed. As I mentioned previously, we are exceedingly diverse community, and so making sure that you're not going to be able to get every single group up there in either checkboxes or examples, but it's important to think about how are we signaling to the different regional groups, perhaps to the different transnational groups, as Maya had mentioned. So all of that is important for to get right, frankly, right? And also, it's important to think about the intersectionality of all our communities, right? There is a fairly large Latino, Asian contingent, right, in different parts of our country. And there are many different other types of combinations that we need to make sure that people are able to find themselves in the actual question design. And so, again, highlighting not only the importance of signaling, but something that Raz had said about the importance of making sure there's meaningful consultation and engagement with the communities themselves to make sure that they are actually seeing their identities reflected back in the questionnaires.
And I just wanted to quickly add about the opportunities. I want to get to that part. We are grateful and very glad to see that for Hispanics and Latinos, that the checkbox structure allows community members to really indicate more than one subgroup or national origin identity. So that's an opportunity there. And we're grateful to see that.
I actually wanted to add another point regarding opportunities. Obviously, I agree with all my wonderful esteemed colleagues in their reflections and observations, because truly it is all sorts of intersections you can have here. Every single one of these groups could cross with another group, and we're going to continue to see that as our nation continues to diversify. But what I find to be an opportunity here is what an amazing moment we have to engage with communities about how they want to see themselves on a forum, how they might engage with a forum, how to think about talking to them about the forum. Because what that means is we're engaging with communities around the data that reflects them. And that then means that we are doing a better job in bringing people into an understanding of how they can be seen and what the data are used for and how it is useful for them in their lives. So my advocate hat says, this is great if we can bring people, as Roz and Maya and Terry were saying, we bring people to the table, but that also means they get invested in this process of ensuring that we are collecting that better and more accurate data for our communities.
Thanks. And I think I've heard all of you say this phrase over the last 30 minutes, but it's this idea that this is great and we have to get it right. And so, ensuring high quality implementation of these changes is critical for its success. And, what guidance is necessary from the OMB to other federal agencies to make sure that this happens? And how do your organizations plan to mobilize communities? You've all talked about engaging your communities so they understand these changes and are ready for efforts like Get Out the Count for the 2030 census.
So I can start, and I'll start from back to front. So I think one of the important things for us, certainly the advocates here, but really any interested stakeholder out there, is we really need to engage with agencies of interest on their action plans, right? We can help provide input today about what goes into the plan that gets published 18 months from now. We should also be monitoring for any variances or exemption applications that come through, and of course weigh in if any do. And then finally, on the Get Out the Count activity, we need to ensure that as we work to educate and conduct outreach to the community for the 2030 census, that we are including education about the new standards and what that means for the community. It's always been a part of all of the GOTC, the Get Out the Count work that all of our groups have done. But now we know that there needs to be an extra emphasis because there's something new. And so helping people understand what that new is. And I think, to Misa's point, also that opportunity to maybe engage people who otherwise hadn't seen themselves previously, it can actually be a mobilizing tactic, assuming they get it right. And then on to the first part around the guidance, I'd say two things for me that stand out. One is it'll be important to provide bridging guidance to agencies and the community with respect to how to compare data that were collected under the previous standards versus data collected under the new standards, right? And to Misa's point about comparison, civil rights enforcement, and the like, it'll be important that we all understand how we should be looking at the data and how we can compare them in a way that makes them as apple to apple as possible. The other piece I think that's important is guidance around coding, right? That is coding the responses that people get to the extent that maybe it doesn't quote unquote fall inside the box, right? I would say that guidance around coding is actually particularly important because self-response is the preferred collection mechanism. You can see it in the notice itself, especially with respect to detailed data. So ensuring a consistent standard across agencies on how to code responses will be critical in ensuring comparability between data sets across agencies. So the bridging helps ensure comparability between data sets across time. And the coding would help to ensure comparability between data sets across agencies.
So I would come in and say +1 to everything Terry said and offer the point about coding, the numbers I gave you in the beginning in terms of the differences between how many Arab Americans the census counts versus our count, how many MENA versus our count. That's entirely a matter of how one would code the available data. And I think it's an incredibly important point to understand. The other thing I would offer to add to kind of the way Terry's talked about this is to just note that we have each of our organizations been deeply engaged in the policy-making process on this by engaging our communities. There were more than 20,000 comments submitted to the Federal Register notice about revising the standards. again, that's sort of not a normal thing that takes place. We literally all individually issued action alerts to folks who normally don't see themselves as part of, the rulemaking process on something and weighing in one way or another. So it was used as an education tool to get us to thinking about how we do the GOTC work. And it laid the foundation for that, and we'll continue to do that as we work with the pushing on the research and testing, the tabulation, the coding, all of that. We really do have to bring our communities along, because the truth is 2030 is not that far away.
And, I want to just echo a couple of themes. First of all, comparability of data and making sure that we can really compare data under the revised standards and under the old standards is very critical for the Latino community, because this is a new world for compilation of data about Latinos, when data about Latinos will not be collected in a separate question. So we really need to think through, talk with the Bureau, talk with the OMB, talk with experts, so that really the stories that the data tells from Census 20 and before the standards, and the stories that the data tells after, are really comparable and meaningful. We have our work cut out for us in terms of our outreach to the Latino community when the new standards are implemented. Our organization in Census 2020 conducted one of the largest get out the count operations in the nation. And we can tell already that there's at least 3 important messages we're going to need to get across to the community, in addition to the importance of being counted. First of all, one message is, where are you going to find Latino on the census form? The second message is, check all that apply. Okay, it's very, very important that people understand that they have options to choose more than one ethnic and racial category and more than one subgroup. And finally, fill out those write-in boxes. Okay, that is really important information. You have a chance here to indicate and let this form and your interaction with this form fully reflect how you identify. So we want to really promote this as an opportunity. What are the best messages? What are the best messengers? How to best communicate this is something we're going to have to do more research on, and the Bureau needs to start planning right now. I want to echo what Maya said about, it's only a few more years before Census 2030, plus there may be forms of this combined question used in other data products. So we need to start planning now.
Mita, it looked like you were going to jump in for a second.
Oh, I wanted to do a shameless plug to say that along with our coalition partners, we have a coalition called Census Counts, and it has a website roadmap to 2030, and it does detail the steps that we need to take to get to 2030, and working through the race and ethnicity standards and messaging to communities as part of that. So, when you said, how does this relate to getting out the count going forward? This is something we're deeply thinking about already now. And this is being folded into the work and amplifying the work.
Yeah, I mean, it's 6 years away, but it comes on very quickly, and a lot of legwork needs to happen in advance of that. So I think, Roz, your comments kind of touched on this question that came in through the Q&A from HCN Media. I read that many people didn't understand the option to choose more than one option, and how do you plan to address this? And so I don't think that's just for NALEO. I think that's for all of the organizations on this call and your partners. But does anyone want to hop in to kind of talk about what that might look like?
Sure. Well, first of all, we know that from the research that the Bureau did on the combined question, that certain community members did understand that. However, as I mentioned, we need to really drill down on this issue and really look at what are the most effective communication strategies to get this message across. We need to, again, do research on who are the best messages and messengers. We need to look at, do we incorporate this into our outreach campaigns as one of the things that we tell people, right? Do we present this as an opportunity, right? What is going to be the best strategy to really educate community members? And we need to do this in consultation with organizations that work with community members. We need to have testing designed to get the input of, different community perspectives in terms of how they might answer the question or deal with outreach strategies. For example, the Bureau does research on people's attitudes and messages and messengers for the census. And so when they do that research, that has to include, community members in surveys or community members in focus groups that really reflect the full diversity of all of our communities.
Thanks, Roz.
Tina, I wanted to add one thing to what Roz said, which is certain people have already been checking more than one box. There was the opportunity to check multiple boxes for race that existed for the 2010 and 2020 census. So what we're facing here is a world where ethnicity is entering that matrix of opportunities to answer. And so what we have is really that chance to truly allow people to engage with, how do I represent myself across various identities, and check multiple boxes. As a result of many of the comments, the question stem got changed to, what is your race and or ethnicity, as a beginning of that signaling process of that it should be more than one, more than two, if that is who you are and how you see yourself. So I think, as Roz says, where it comes in is that real opportunity to say, like, many of us have intersectional identities, and please use this forum as a chance to express that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one additional piece is, before we even get to that, sort of a soft, I guess, runway, if you like, is how we talk about data, how we present data from the 2020 census or from other data sets, to the extent that we're able to, provide that level of detailed information. I think that's also another signal to folks who perhaps would identify as such, as like, oh, there's a place for me. There's a way I can express that identity. And so when you combine that with the get out the count activities, the educational activities that we've been talking about, that will hopefully all work together to bring folks, that understanding that they can identify with as many options as they, feel reflects their identity.
Mm-hmm. I think the other important aspect of this is kind of the other end of the life cycle of data, of how data actually get tabulated and reported and then disseminated when people are responding about more than one race and or ethnicity. So that's kind of an important next step. I have a question for Maya. A question from a reporter is that, what's the logic behind lumping the Middle East and North African populations together, especially for health data? I wonder if people of Middle Eastern backgrounds still check other because they don't consider themselves North African, and vice versa. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I love that question. And the reason I love that question is because it's a way to illustrate the point about disaggregate data. When we talk about these issues, I've often explained, because it's a new category, I've explained it in sort of, we are an ethnicity as Arab Americans, or MENA populations, like Latinos. So we're an ethnicity, and we will check off an ethnic category and then check off the racial categories that we identify with. When it comes to disaggregate data, I actually also make the case that Terry's made and say that it's a bit like the AAPI community. If you aren't careful and you don't look at disaggregate data, you could perhaps suggest that there was an overcount in the 2020 census of Asian Americans. And then when you look under the hood, you're like, oh boy, no, there's some issues there, right? So the same thing honestly plays out here. MENA is a broad category. for those folks who are from the Middle East and North Africa, but it's simply a checkbox that we then write in or identify a checkbox within that. So it's a minimum reporting category, and then you see your checkbox and you see your write-in example. And it's not ideal in some ways, frankly, but it is the best that we got based on decades worth of work and real deep engagement and partnership with the Census Bureau folks who did test it and found that, yes, it did elicit more accurate data. So it's now, once we get it right with the signaling examples, the job is then on us to sort of explain that it's a bit of a catch-all. And then within that, you identify yourself, and then folks from the back end on the coding list will then be able to pull that information. So I think it really does demonstrate the disaggregate data point, because if we're not being able to pull the other information, it doesn't tell me anything. If I just get statistics about MENA populations, that's just not going to work.
Yeah, and it points to the importance of those subgroup data that we're trying to collect now. And Maya, one more question for you from Bloomberg. Is there an expectation that MENA-owned businesses will be recognized as minority-owned now?
Excellent question. Very clear and important on this point, because it's also regrettably been used as a bit of a mis and disinformation campaign when we've talked about the race and ethnicity standards in general and the importance of a new MENA minimum reporting category. No, the census and other federal data forms that will now have this do not convey any eligibility for federal programs at all. So it is not accurate to suggest that this is a vehicle to federal minority status in the several SBA, Small Business Administration, or any of that. It is about a statistical agency collecting more accurate data.
Thanks, Maya, for that important clarification. And before, I have one more question that I'll direct mostly to Mita, but again, others can jump in. But before I ask that, just another reminder, if you want to ask a question, please plug it into the Q&A. We do have a little bit of time left. So for Mita, we've talked a lot about the federal agencies, federal partners, but even though these are federal minimum standards, they roll down and impact state and local agencies. They impact, I think as a researcher, I can say most researchers just kind of default to what the federal agencies or OMB requires. And so for states and counties that are motivated to make these changes, what do they need in order to implement them? And are there states that you think could serve as models for implementing these higher quality standards as well?
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. So as you know, Tina, and as I hope others know, in December, the Leadership Conference put out a report, Disaggregation Nation, a landscape analysis of state race and ethnicity data collection standards. So we actually have a baseline to understand where things stand prior to the new standards coming out. And there are a lot of hurdles to overcome in the implementation for states to adopt the new standards. Firstly, they would need to understand some of the points people raised today. What would it look like from a coding perspective? How would we bridge the data that we are currently collecting with new data that's coming? How do we make it, to use a very technical term, interoperable with all of our other data sets? And I think the federal government needs to recognize that there are states that will be motivated to update, and it would actually benefit both the federal government and the states to have that commonality of data collection. So if they can help with providing states on what the guidance would look like for them to implement it. Of course, the other issue is unfunded mandates are always hard. So if there's any way that states could have some mechanisms, some funds to be able to start looking at transforming their data systems to update them to at least meet the federal standards, that would be great. Our report show quite a few states that have started making really great strides. Oregon is an example of a state that's really looking at implementing many different subcategories, as well as collecting data on language and disability. They've been incredibly thoughtful about it. New Jersey just passed new legislation that really looks at giving the state time. It's a similar point to the federal government. It gives 18 months to start thinking about the implementation. New York, when they implemented their law, they paid heed to what I just said, though I didn't say it back then, but they provided funding for the actual implementation of it. So I'd say, various states have done different components of it. Of course, I have to call out California, which did a great job in starting to roll this out for the Asian American community and is looking at how can it be expanded to other communities. And I think the lesson there of like, when you've already started in one community, how do you take it to the next community is something the federal government can look at as to like, what does it mean to roll it out, step by step and have different communities understand the impact it has on their lives.
And I would just quickly add that also educating states and localities about the ability to go beyond the standards, to tailor this to the data that's needed about their communities. So, Mita mentioned California. Another effort that California is going to have to look at seriously is that there are many Latinos who also identify with indigenous Native American groups, such as Aztec or Mayan, or based on their language, Zapotec, Oaxacans. How can we go beyond what might be considered the detailed categories and tailor the disaggregation for the identities and for the communities that are in particular states, localities?
Thank you, guys. I think there's one more question, but I think all of you have touched on it a little bit, but I just want to make sure that there are no final words you want to make about it. What resources are needed to successfully implement the new standards? Money obviously is a major one, but what can all of you speak to, what specifically might be valuable either at the federal level or at the state and local levels?
Happy to start and turn it over to folks. Absolutely, Tina, right? Money. And I think the importance of making sure that the federal budget for the Census Bureau allows for a robust research and testing to be able to take place between now and 2030 is absolutely critical. But because this is a press event, I also just want to make one point about the important role that media plays in this process. This is one of those things where, regrettably, there's been a bit of a politicization of data collection, and the decennial in particular. So I think it's really important that as we talk about these issues, as we report on them, as we share information and the milestones that are contained in the roadmap that Mita mentioned, that we continue to bring it back to this is about collecting race and ethnicity data and not necessarily about the kinds of things that we might hear from some congressional members or others. We just have to acknowledge that this is playing out in an environment that is unfortunately not always conducive to meaningful conversations about things as simple as race and ethnicity data collection, but yet is incredibly meaningful as getting it right. So I would offer that and defer to my colleagues the remainder.
I think another important resource is that the administration needs to clearly impress upon agencies that putting together action plans, meaningful action plans that are going to really chart the course. It is a priority. It's not, one in a list of 40 things you have to do and you'll get around to it when you can. So it's having that kind of political will from the administration and having that communicated to agencies that this is important. This is an important part of your job. And also, again, emphasizing why this is going to help the economic, the social, the civic well-being of our nation. To make this a priority is going to be critical as well.
So I completely agree with my fabulous colleagues on their points, and I think I'm going to go really more micro than the wonderful comments from Maya and Roz, and the ones I'm sure Mita will have to share. But the what I talked about with respect to the exemption variance process, I think it would be really good if OMB could share explicit kind of their process and how they plan to approach this, and whatever criteria can be shared about what does it mean to have sufficient justification to allow for an exemption. For example, what processes, outlining the processes of when public input can be collected, or whatever meat they can add to those bones, I think would be really important and helpful for us as we move forward. In large part because, as I had noted, there wasn't a stampede to do data disaggregation, even though agencies could previously. So, are we going to see perhaps an attempt by many agencies to claim that they don't need to do this? And, I think just we don't know what we don't know. So let's be prepared for the worst case scenario on that front.
So I will add a call to action, which is akin in some ways to Maya's. And I know that for the reporters that are here, they don't need to hear it because they're here, but maybe you could tell your colleagues. I would challenge everyone on this call, everyone that we meet, everyone we intersect with, that we have an interaction with, to recognize how much data are playing a role in everyone's day-to-day lives, whether it's the school that you go to, your voting district, what educational resources you have, what healthcare is provided, what healthcare outcomes might have been pre-baked. It is everywhere, and it's very hard, for instance, to read an article that does not have data referenced in it somewhere, and it usually comes from a federal agency, usually the Census Bureau, but not always. So I think it's incumbent upon us to ground ourselves in how critical these data are to everyone's lives, and for all of us to understand who we are as Americans and what our lived experiences are. And my challenge is that I think we should be referencing that as much as possible so that we can ensure that we not only continue getting good and accurate data, but that we get even better and more accurate data.
Thank you all. And I'll give a shameless plug for another RWJF funded resource, which is the Data Equity Center at UCLA, led by Ninez Ponce and AJ Scheitler. They are providing training and technical assistance to researchers to promote and advance data equity. Part of data equity is ensuring that populations are visible in and have access to their data, and data disaggregation is a major component of that. So researchers can reach out to them for support around how to disaggregate data in a way that's more meaningful. And I also want to kind of reiterate something I said earlier about how much of this conversation obviously has focused on the federal, state, local, county policy levels, but the implications of this change for the field of research and practice is huge. It is just going to change the way in which most researchers collect race and ethnicity data. And so that is from your small project all the way up to the census. So that's kind of what I'm most excited about, is that it really is going to change the field, the research field, and how we collect this information broadly. So I want to thank our esteemed panelists. I think it's been an amazing conversation, and thank everyone everyone from the media who's been able to join us for the last hour, and hope that you got as much out of the conversation as I feel I did. You can learn more about our work at our website that you can see on this slide, and we will be sending out the recording and resources from today's call. Please take a moment to take the survey that will pop up after you exit Zoom, and we would love your feedback, and feel free to reach out with any follow-up questions following this webinar. Thank you again.